It landed like a thunderclap. An investigative report by Julie Roys put Daystar Television's finances under a microscope, and suddenly questions that had been whispered in corners about luxury spending, family authority, and how donor dollars were used, became a national conversation about faith, money, and accountability. If you want to follow this as it unfolds, every statement, every audit, every response, hit subscribe and turn on the bell now so you don't miss the next update. This is a clear, human account of what the Roys report uncovered, why it matters, how people reacted, and what the crisis reveals about the fragile contract between donors and ministries. Daystar Television grew from modest beginnings into one of the world's largest Christian broadcasters under Marcus and Joni Lamb. For decades, Daystar offered preaching and worship to millions around the globe, and the network became a familiar presence in the living rooms of charismatic and evangelical Christians. That rise gave the Lamb family influence, boardrooms, studio floors, and a rotating roster of high-profile ministry partners who trusted the network with airtime and outreach. The company's growth and family-centered leadership style offered both a platform and a paradox. Daystar's tight family control helped it expand quickly, but that same concentration of authority also created vulnerabilities that investigative scrutiny would later expose. The story's shock value intensified when reports emerged tying investigative findings to a sudden leadership shift at Daystar. Julie Roys reporting detailed internal documents and expense records that raised uncomfortable questions about compensation and spending within the Daystar organization. Roy's work focused on a range of financial items, most dramatically, internal documents suggesting a large increase in Joni Lamb's compensation after Marcus Lamb's death and line items that critics said resembled luxury spending. These were not idle accusations floated anonymously, they were documented claims accompanied by records and reporting that readers and donors could inspect. The appearance of internal paperwork combined with on-record interviews made the story difficult to dismiss as rumor. At the core of the controversy were specific allegations that struck at donors' expectations. Reporters pointed to expense items such as what appeared to be high-cost travel, private flights, and other expenditures that many view as inconsistent with the frugal stewardship expected of non-profits funded by individual donors, particularly donors who are elderly or fiscally vulnerable. One of the most inflammatory claims concerned allegations that ministry funds had been used to underwrite personal travel and lifestyles. For donors who give sacrificially, the notion that large sums could be diverted to luxury amenities instead of mission work provoked anger and disillusionment. The perception that those on a ministry payroll might be living lavishly on donor support threatened to unravel the trust upon which charities and ministries depend. Investigative reports made those line items public and asked uncomfortable questions about accountability and oversight. The timing of the controversy magnified its impact. These financial questions circulated not in a vacuum but against a backdrop of other scandals around Daystar, family rifts, allegations relating to the network's internal handling of sensitive abuse claims, and personnel shakeups. When Roy's articles connected financial documents with the erosion of trust, programmers publicly pausing broadcasts, prominent voices pulling shows, and donors asking for accountability, the pressure on Daystar's leadership mounted quickly. Media-saturated audiences began asking a simple but consequential question: if a ministry's leaders are not transparent about how money is used, what else is being concealed? The question moved from moral outrage into organizational crisis as partners and viewers demanded documentation and proof. Julie Roy's credibility as an investigative reporter made her findings hard to dismiss. She is known for careful documentation and for giving subjects the chance to respond. Her reporting included internal emails and documents that, in the eyes of many readers, corroborated the pattern she described. That mattered because in the modern media environment, allegations without evidence are quickly dismissed as mudslinging. Roy's detailed approach meant the story was built on documents and recorded statements, not anonymous whispers, which forced a stronger, clearer reaction from both the public and other media outlets. Her pieces sparked follow-up coverage and created pressure on Daystar to produce corroborating explanations, audits, and transparent accounting. For many viewers and donors, an investigative journalist's meticulous reporting is the gold standard, and the presence of primary documents shifted this story from rumor to record. One of the most visceral effects of Roy's reporting was the allegation that older and financially vulnerable donors were being targeted or exploited, sometimes described in reporting as donor exploitation. Those claims cut especially deep because many who give to ministries do so based on faith and trust. News that a ministry might be prioritizing luxury or personal benefit over mission threatened the moral legitimacy of fundraising appeals and raised legal and ethical questions about solicitation practices. The question is not simply whether leaders live comfortably, that's common in many non-profit and for-profit sectors, but whether the financial decisions and disclosures match the promises made to donors about the use of their gifts. The appearance of a disconnect prompted some donors to pause giving and compelled several program partners to distance themselves from Daystar until clarity was provided. As the story spread, the reaction divided communities. Supporters of Joni Lamb, many longtime viewers who had built spiritual habits around Daystar programming, stood by the network at first, citing loyalty and the ministry's decades of broadcasting. For those supporters, Roy's investigation seemed like an attack on a beloved institution and its leaders. On the other side were critics who argued that loyalty cannot be a shield against wrongdoing and that independent oversight is essential to prevent abuse. This fault line, between protecting a ministry and demanding strict accountability, split congregations and social feeds. The debate was not merely about money but about what a faith-based institution owes those it leads: transparency, responsible stewardship, and a willingness to submit to independent review. Daystar's public responses further complicated the picture. Statements released by the network and by Joni Lamb denied wrongdoing and emphasized cooperation with investigators where applicable. Daystar argued that its internal reviews had addressed certain concerns and sought to reassure donors that funds were used for ministry operations rather than personal enrichment. But to many observers, those responses felt vague, defensive, or incomplete, especially in light of media reports that included specific expense line items and internal memos. The absence of an immediate, transparent audit or a third-party review left a vacuum that media coverage and social sharing quickly filled with speculation. When an institution's response is perceived as inadequate, trust erodes even faster than if wrongdoing were actually proven. The perception of concealment is often as powerful as evidence of misconduct. The controversy also prompted concrete reactions across the Christian media landscape. Several well-known ministries and personalities paused or ended programming agreements with Daystar, signaling that the reputational risk of association had grown too large. These departures were consequential because Daystar's model depends on a wide network of third-party programmers. If partners pull shows, the network's programming schedule and fundraising base can be significantly disrupted. The departures also signaled to donors and viewers that trusted institutions were taking the allegations seriously enough to reconsider long-standing relationships. That momentum created a feedback loop. Media coverage drove program departures, departures raised public alarm, and public alarm drove more coverage. For Daystar, the result was a reputational and operational squeeze that could not be ignored. As the storm intensified, the conflict often framed itself as a personal and ideological clash. Joni Lamb defended the ministry with spiritual language, calling on prayer, asserting her integrity, and describing some of the reporting as malicious. Julie Roys and supporters of investigative accountability framed their work as a necessary defense of donors and vulnerable people. To many supporters of Roy's work, the point was not to attack faith but to protect the integrity of ministry. To many of Joni's defenders, Roy's represented an outsider disrupting an institution from the outside. That polarity made the debate more emotionally charged and harder to resolve, because it pitted community identity against corrective oversight. The public had to decide, are we more loyal to institutions that comfort us, or to the principles of transparency and truth that make institutions trustworthy? The answer mattered not just for Daystar but for the health of the broader faith ecosystem. Beyond reputations and programming, the controversy raised legal and governance questions. Non-profit law and best practices call for independent boards, clear financial disclosures, conflict of interest policies, and accountability mechanisms for leadership. The Daystar debate illustrated what can happen when a family-run ministry concentrates authority without robust, independent checks. Small errors of judgment can become systemic vulnerabilities. Lawyers, non-profit governance experts, and watchdogs argue that reforms, not merely statements of denial, are required to restore donor confidence. For skeptics, the most persuasive path back to trust is visible change, independent financial audits, board restructuring to include outside members, and transparent, routine reporting of ministry finances. The moment thus served as a broader call to action for ministries to strengthen governance in order to avoid similar eruptions in the future. What are the practical takeaways from this crisis? First, faith-based organizations cannot hide behind spiritual language to shield questionable financial practices. Donors deserve clear, accessible accounting. Second, transparency is no longer optional. Credibility depends on openness and demonstrable governance. Third, journalistic oversight plays a positive role when it brings documents and questions into the public square in careful, documented ways. Fourth, public trust, once broken, is difficult to repair and requires radical humility and clear reforms. Finally, this controversy highlights the deeper cultural tension in some religious circles between protecting insiders and protecting truth. Resolving that tension will define whether ministries rebuild trust or continue to erode donor and viewer confidence. The story is still unfolding. Additional reporting, audits, and possible legal inquiries may clarify certain questions or raise new ones. In any case, Daystar's crisis is a wider lesson about power, stewardship, and the obligations of leadership. Ministries that ask people to give sacrificially have a moral and fiduciary duty to account for those resources transparently. When that duty is called into question, the response must be substantial and verifiable, not just spiritual language or defensive statements. If you want to track what happens next, independent audits, board changes, program departures, and official statements, subscribe and turn on notifications so you'll be among the first to get the updates. For donors and viewers, the practical action is straightforward: ask tough questions, demand independent verification, and support reforms that protect both mission and the vulnerable people ministries serve. The crisis at Daystar is not just one network's problem, it's a broader reminder that faith, money, and power must be handled with care, transparency, and humility if they are to do any real good in the world.